Good morning, everybody. I'm Gwyn Thurlow, the CEO and General Counsel here at the New Zealand Deerstalkers. By way of background, the Deerstalkers represents its 13,000 members who are big game hunters. We have 35,000 supporters, 49 branches, and we represent the approximately 85,000 big game hunters. Firstly, NZDA would like to note that we support the bill with some reservations. We support the decision to repeal and replace the Arms Act 1983, and we support firearms regulation that is practical, proportionate, evidence-based, and focused on genuine public safety outcomes. We think it's important to avoid unnecessary costs. We've seen overly complex regulations, and we've seen a large administrative burden placed on licensed firearm holders. We also believe that firearms have a place in New Zealand and should be in the possession of fit and proper people, and we feel it's appropriate that the Arms Bill focuses on the fit and proper test. While we support the bill's overall direction, there are areas where we are disappointed and our community have let us know, including the retention of the non-pistol shooting clubs and ranges framework, which the government had promised to repeal, and the limited progress arising from the firearms registry review. In addition, there have been aspects of implementation, the timeframes, the transitional arrangements, which we think would be beneficial if they could be refined, and we've provided detailed requests and timeframes in the back of our submission. NZDA wants to be clear that the final form of the bill, in our opinion, reflects political compromise rather than a genuinely risk-based reset of firearms law. While the bill is an improvement on a fragmented and poorly implemented framework, which it is going to replace, its outcome has been materially constrained by political fear, media pressure over the last 2 years, and a continued reluctance by part of the political system to engage honestly with firearms policy. Firearms law in New Zealand continues to be shaped by bias and fear, rather than by objective assessment of who possesses risk and who does not. It is particularly frustrating at a time when farmers, landowners, conservation agencies, local communities are all calling for more effective game animal control, pest animal control, and better biodiversity outcomes, yet we see successive governments continue to restrict, complicate, and stigmatise the use of firearms, primarily the most effective tool for achieving those outcomes. This contradiction between public demands for control of our pests and game animals and an ongoing mistrust of firearms users has not been resolved by this bill. NZDA is also disappointed that certain shooting sports remain prohibited, not because of demonstrated safety risk, but because of political sensitivity. While NZDA does not represent all shooting disciplines, we support lawful sport, fit and proper individuals, and evidence-based regulation. The continued prohibition of some activities reflects a lack of courage to distinguish between criminal misuse and legitimate supervised sporting use. Accordingly, while the NZDA supports the bill as a necessary step, it does not represent the best possible outcome for our sport, for hunting, for game animal and pest animal species management, or for New Zealand's wider biodiversity objectives. We say that this bill is a step and it's not an endpoint, and it reflects a process achieved despite political restraint and not because those constraints no longer exist. Since 2019, many law-abiding firearms users have experienced firearms regulatory system as adversarial, inconsistent, and at times openly distrustful of fit and proper licence holders. For a large proportion of the firearms community, the period following the 2019 reforms has been characterised by frustration, uncertainty, and a sense of being collectively blamed and stigmatised for actions that they did not commit. The NZDA considers that the way many responsible hunters, shooters, volunteers, collectors, and rural firearms users have felt and been treated over the past several years has not been acceptable. Decisions have appeared to be driven by assumption and not evidence, by compliance targets bias rather than public safety outcomes, and by institutional risk aversion rather than a sense of fairness. Despite repeated assurances, there has been no meaningful acknowledgement of the distress, the financial cost and loss, or the loss of trust experienced by the compliant firearms community. As a result, rushed legislation, the change, the buyback, poor implementation, and constant inconsistency of regulatory practice. Privacy concerns relating to the firearms remain unresolved, and we continue to see people discouraged from engagement, particularly among those who store firearms in locations and those who have legitimate concerns about their data security and their home security. There is a digital divide, and the digital divide is ongoing. We've had people say that they can't engage with the current licensing system and the renewal system or the register system. This is because we have poor internet access, limited digital literacy, and an absence of meaningful digital alternatives that have created barriers to disproportionately affect the licensed firearm owners community. You can just look at the stats relating to registration to see that this is true. NZDA does not accept that these outcomes have been accidental or significant. The data does not lie. When lawful, fit and proper people exit the system because it has become too difficult, too intrusive, too hostile to engage with, public safety is actually not improved. Instead, the regulatory system became narrower, less representative, increasingly disconnected from the communities it was meant to regulate. And these outcomes point not to a failure of our law-abiding firearms owner community, but they point to a failure of a system and its design and its implementation. NZDA is deeply concerned about the ongoing and unresolved question of cost. The firearms registry, the licensing system, the associated regulatory infrastructure have all been at the significant public expenditure with little transparency around the long-term operational cost, any value for money or any measurable safety benefit. This bill contemplates a new regulatory agency, further systems development and an expanded regulatory function. NZDA considers it essential that the true cost of this framework is acknowledged and justified. Law-abiding firearms users and taxpayers are entitled to ask whether the system that is being built is effective, proportionate and even affordable and sustainable. Who is asking the question, are the changes you're making us safer? NZDA records strong concern that the continued freezing and crystallisation of the shooting clubs and ranges system is an ongoing and unresolved issue. Since 2019, the ability to establish, certify and roll or expand shooting ranges has stalled. This has had a direct and negative impact on safe, supervised environments where people can learn to shoot, maintain competence, undertake hunter training and education, train in ethical firearms use and participate in competition shooting. This result is a paradox created by a bad law. Firearms users are expected to meet higher standards of safety and compliance, while access to lawful, safe, practical training facilities has been constrained by the law. This isn't a theoretical issue. Across New Zealand, clubs reported declining range availability, volunteer burnout, and regulatory uncertainty that has deferred investment and development. Without access to ranges, new licence holders struggle to gain experience, experienced hunters struggle to maintain skills, and organised competition becomes less viable. A system that restricts access to ranges while demanding higher compliance is internally inconsistent and ultimately counterproductive to our safety. NZDA considers that the continued inclusion of the clubs and ranges parts relating to non-pistol organisations within this restrictive regulatory framework without a clear pathway forward to enable new and existing facilities to be maintained and kept open represents a serious and unresolved flaw in this bill. We suggest Part 6, the new Part 5, should be repealed. If the government is serious about safety, ethics, compliance, it must address how people are practically expected to learn, train and shoot in safe environments. Without reform in this area, the objectives of the whole bill will remain partially unachievable. NZDA places these concerns on record not as abstract policy objections, but as a reflection of what has occurred across our membership over the last intervening years since 2019. These are our lived realities, and they are not addressed through this bill, through regulation or implementation. Then if we need a future reform, we must take the bold step to seek to repeal and replace certain parts of this bill that is going to be put to the House. So in summary, NZDA supports the ARM Bill as a necessary and an overdue step towards repairing some of the damage from the regulatory framework that has been weakened by years of reactive and poorly coordinated reform. The repeal and replacement of the 1983 Act is the right approach, and the bill is clearly an improvement, but as it stands, it is not the best we could do. NZDA must state plainly that the bill does not go far enough. It fails to meaningfully unwind many of the bad policy decisions, the overregulation and the structural failures introduced since 2019. And that is despite clear evidence that any of those have improved public safety.